there was a new person teaching composition at his college named Warren Benson. So after the spring concert, which had gone really, really well, when everybody had gone, Warren was still there. And Warren comes up and he says, "You've done a terrific job. The band sounds fantastic. But why do you play that funny music?" I was crushed.
Hello, and welcome to episode 51 of the BandWagon podcast for the week of March 3rd, 2025. On this edition of the program, news and notes from the band world, including our launch into the next 50 episodes, a stinging indictment, a band-related internet rabbit hole of the week that doubles as a mystery, and I have a conversation that I made sure to prepare for hard. I'm your host, Rob Hammerton. Hello, dear listeners. A couple of big deals this week. The second big deal that you'll hear is, of course, the trio section, which I was teasing pretty hard in last week's episode. Perhaps now you get why, if you've seen this week's episode artwork. But the first of the big deals that you will hear is, I will admit, something that I have resisted doing on this podcast, in an overt way at least so far. And that is leaning hard into the news of the week. Not the band news, the news. For a year now, I have figured that sort of thing was what a lot of my listenership was coming here to be away from for an hour or so every week. Some of them have told me so. I also figured that, in terms of downloads and faithful listenership, much as I often say in a community band context, it's not in my best interest to encourage people to go away, and much as I obviously want to retain as many listeners as possible, well, some things I just feel like I gotta say. Consequences be danged. Also, over the last little while at my church gig, we've wrestled with the question of how loud should we be about this and this and this topic, pride flags and pronouns and such. And at least in terms of our church staff, we've come to the conclusion that as many people as we might not please and possibly even lose as a result of taking a stand on a particular issue, who knows how many people we might actually gain by taking a stand on an issue that they care about. You know, hey, that church stands for that, and so do I. Maybe I should check them out. And also, as you may recall having been mentioned in my trio section talk with Scott Monty back a few episodes, if you don't address an issue, people may think you're wussing out on it, or they may take it upon themselves to assume they know what your opinion about it is, and that assumption may or may not reflect well upon you. So, tighten your percussion harnesses, and away we go. Let's play the first strain. In this episode's first strain, news and notes from the band world. Dateline, Holly, Michigan, or Rome, Italy. The Holly High School Bronco Marching Band has traveled intercontinentally for a once-in-a-lifetime performance. The band had planned the trip for 2 years. They sent 70 students to Italy to perform on New Year's Day at St. Peter's Square at the Vatican for audiences that included Pope Francis. Band director Ben Baldwin said that the parade organizers specifically requested American songs for the crowds to enjoy. Baldwin said, quote, "Hand clap and Since You've Been Gone, we did a little bit of Rick Astley, we did some Motown, we performed My Girl, we did our fight song." Baldwin was asked if the band rickrolled the Pope. He replied, quote, "Okay, I'm going to admit it. We were playing Never Gonna Give You Up, but I think, in our defense, the crowd loved it." Dateline, Morgantown, West Virginia. West Virginia University's Board of Governors has greenlit the start of construction for the new Pride practice facility for the Mountaineer Marching Band. Last year in this space, in April I think, I chronicled that project's brush with local politics and potential corruption. Phase 1 of the Pride practice facility project has been budgeted at $1,662,000. The construction will take place at Med Center Field on the WVU Health Sciences campus. The new artificial turf field will be named Don Wilcox Field, after the late Mountaineer Band director. Construction was scheduled to begin this past Friday, March 1st, and was expected to be completed in July, in time for the start of fall band camp. When the Pride isn't using the field, according to a WVU press release, it will be used for intramural sports. And that's news and notes from the band world for this week. If you have a news item you think should be included in this segment, send me a link via email to heybandwagon@yahoo.com. We'll now take a quick breather, and on the other side, a less gentle rant than last week's. Hope you'll stay with me. Okay, let's pick it up at the second strain. In this week's second strain, the aforementioned stand that I shall now take. Here's an item that I saw posted on social media last week. It's from a Thai-American composer named Kevin Karonsi. That's spelled Charoensri. He's based in San Diego, California, and he wrote this. Quote, I am honored to have had my piece, entitled Rising Light, my response to post-COVID Asian hate, programmed by the President's own United States Marine Band, and I've been looking forward to their performance in collaboration with Equity Arc on May 4th, 2025. Additionally, I was honored to have worked with the underprivileged and underrepresented high school students participating in the Equity Arc program, who would have played side by side with the Marine Band. It has come to my attention that the program, one based on equity and diversity of voices, is no longer supported at the federal level under this administration, and it was for this reason that the program and performance were canceled. I am saddened and frustrated that this is the case. As one of the living composers of color on the program, I stand on the shoulders of those before me, most recently the Kennedy Center's artists and staff, and know I would not be who I am today without their influence in the music world. My heart further hurts for the high school students who would have participated in the Equity Arc program, who have all lost a substantial part of their music education. The arts are an essential part of an educated population. Thank you to Darren Lynn, Ryan Nolan, and the staff of the President's Own and Equity Arc for fighting for our voices to be heard. I look forward to the day where my music and the diverse voices of composers like myself will once again be welcomed on the national stage. This statement is composed of my own personal views and are not endorsed or associated with Equity Arc nor the President's Own U.S. Marine Band." Unquote. Plenty of saddening and maddening and sometimes frankly frightening executive orders and middle-of-the-night firings and organizational restructurings and such have come down during the first month of this new presidential administration, and they all, at least from my perspective here at BandWagon World Headquarters, have smacked of pettiness and short-sightedness and selfishness and nihilism and a seemingly uniform and universal wish to knock things and people over rather than lifting them up. But for some reason, even though this little news item has nothing to do with the fate of Social Security or national security, this one got me right in the feels, as the kids say. This one made me profoundly sad. Now, there was, of course, setup for this little cancellation of this little musical performance. A week or so before this Rising Light post appeared, the National Endowment for the Arts revised its grant application guidelines to conform with the wishes of the President's executive order regarding terminology and activity related to diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts within federal government agencies. As a person named Tom Fitzgerald posted on Facebook on February 17th, quote, "Any artist, organization, or venue that receives federal funding must now monitor executive orders and new legislation and must cancel any future artistic programming that implies dissent. Art can't be interpretable to contain anti-Christian bias, or to acknowledge the existence of transgender people, or to promote elective abortion, or a very long list that will grow with every stroke of the pen. The First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution no longer applies to federally funded art organizations, or venues, but must align with the vision of the White House." Unquote. In part, the new National Endowment for the Arts grant application guidelines now include these terms. Quote, "The applicant agrees that if the applicant is selected and becomes an NEA grant recipient, the applicant will not operate any programs promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, that violate any applicable federal anti-discrimination laws in accordance with Executive Order Number 14173. The applicant understands that federal funds shall not be used to promote gender ideology, pursuant to Executive Order Number 14168, entitled Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government." Unquote. This is passive-aggressive government censorship, y'all. A torch has been taken to the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, all in the name of compliance with new policies that are masquerading as deterrents to discrimination, but in fact are themselves proponents of discrimination. And in many cases, you can cry all you want about cancel culture, but the new overarching policy of the United States federal government is, if you're not straight, white, and male, we are canceling you. And in fact, the implication is, if you're not those things, we are actively working to erase you from public American life. Not just your work, not just your creations, you, yourself. That is not what the arts are, fundamentally. And there are enough people in the band world alone who are, well, let's make a list, however incomplete it might be, people of color, people of faiths other than Christianity, people who are disabled, because those dreaded and demonized DEI efforts also have paid attention to issues of accessibility, people who are gay and lesbian and bisexual and transgender and all the rest of that, people who are women. There are more than enough of those people, who are part and parcel of the band world, to convince me that those new U.S. federal government policies, which aim to restrict, to silence, to metaphorically or actually disappear people who don't look like or love like or worship like the people who have taken charge of the government, those policies don't represent what the band world is, fundamentally, either. Hereabouts, I usually do a faint euphemism and make reference to my late college band director, or one of my favorite teachers, or a wise person who once said this or that. Partly I do that so that every single episode of BandWagon isn't all about George Parks and the UMass Band. There are other groups and other people in the band world, and there are people listening to this podcast who have great reverence for and great memories of other band directors and other bands. And, well, band is a place for everyone, and I feel it's important to apply that idea to this podcast project too. But yeah, during his life, George N. Parks repeatedly said, starred thought, band is a place for everyone. No exceptions, no exclusions. If you love band, you should be able to do band. If you love to compose music, you should be able to find opportunities to have it played in public. If you love the arts, you should be able to practice the arts. No exceptions. And I know there will be people who will hear all this and say, but we're not limiting your ability to do band, or to compose music and have it performed, or to practice the arts. You can find private organizations who may provide funding for that. But if the infamous 2010 Supreme Court decision nicknamed Citizens United applies, and God knows it applies to politics and election campaign finance, if indeed, as Citizens United implies, money is speech, then how the United States of America spends its collected tax revenue does indeed describe what it says, and the policies and philosophies it now espouses. Which in this case means that yes, the United States of America, or at least its government, maybe not all of its actual population, is committed to limiting free artistic expression. Because what we're dealing with here, fundamentally, is a bunch of people who are now running our federal government in a way that is guided by the philosophy, America is not a place for everyone, America is only a place for people like us. So, yes, I push back against that. At this point, we've long since allowed all this to get well past the question of Republicans or Democrats, conservatives or liberals, right-wingers or left-wingers. Now, it's a question of the haves versus the have-nots, the powerful versus the powerless. And frankly, at least according to my powers of observation, it's now also the creative people versus the destructive people. Not merely the artistic creators versus the people whom I suspect have never themselves been purveyors of or even particularly intentional consumers of the arts. But now it's the people who clap for, cheer for, lift up others versus the people who take pleasure in the suffering of others. The people who see life as a zero-sum game where they can only succeed if someone else fails, where they can only win if someone else loses, where they can only be happy if someone else suffers. And the people who have the resources and, at present, the power to find or create ways to ensure other people's suffering. Particularly the other people who don't look or love or worship like they do, and especially the other people who make them feel icky, or who make them, secretly, in their heart of hearts, feel inadequate. I know which side I'm on, and I'm pretty sure I know which side most of my listenership is on. I mean, never assume anything, as the starred thought goes, but do make educated guesses. Now, because the band world is vast and contains multitudes, I'm sure that it's statistically very likely that there are band people who voted for members of the political party which now controls the White House and both houses of Congress, who do in fact support the current executive orders and other efforts of the federal government I've described just now. And if there are listeners who answer to that description, who have listened to this second strain and are still listening, and you come back next week to continue to listen, I welcome that, because beyond sustaining download numbers, this means you're at least not storming off, and that is something. Maybe we can have a conversation. If you've listened to this and determined that it's the last time you'll listen to BandWagon, I am sorry about that. But perhaps in the same way that my church may pick up new members because the signs outside our building express our stances about things, maybe for every person who bails out on BandWagon, several others will be enticed to jump in. That, in the end, is beyond my control. But what I can control is this, what I put on this podcast. And if the views and opinions expressed on this program are solely those of the individual creator and do necessarily represent the official views of Hammerton Media, then not only does what I say reflect upon me, but what I both do and don't leave unsaid, it all matters, if you follow me. The upshot is this, I think. If band is a place for everyone, then any policy that limits that is a policy worth pushing back against as hard as possible. So I will. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. And now, after this break, the conversation which all those people who just shut this podcast episode off are going to really regret missing out on. Okay, let's change keys and get into the trio section. This week in the trio section, my guest has a resume that few others have. Someone once said to me, if there were a Mount Rushmore of the band activity, this gentleman would be on it. He founded the New England Conservatory Wind Ensemble, conducted it for 30 years, where he commissioned and premiered works by many of the world's leading composers, including John Harbison, Daniel Pinkham, Vincent Persichetti, Gunther Schuller, and others, which by itself would constitute a remarkable career, I would think. But that NEC work came on the heels of a dozen years' worth of teaching in the Ithaca, New York public schools, where under his direction, the Ithaca High School Band became one of the finest ensembles in the country, with the commissioning project itself generating 24 works or so by distinguished American composers. And that high school concert band took its place on the John Philip Sousa Foundation's historic Roll of Honor of high school concert bands from 1920 to 1980. And after his official retirement from NEC, he's another one of these folks who didn't retire to a rocking chair on a porch, that's for sure. The retirement period is now pushing determinedly on into its third decade, wherein he maintains a very active guest conducting, teaching, and writing schedule. Under his feet, you will find no moss whatsoever. What a thrill to be able to welcome to the BandWagon podcast NEC Wind Ensemble Conductor Emeritus, Frank-l-Battisti. Dr. Battisti, thank you so much for making time for this.
Nice to be here.
Usually the first thing I do is to ask the people with whom I'm having these conversations a set of questions that are meant to give listeners an initial sense of who they're listening to. And those questions tend to be fairly biographical. What's your primary instrument? What's your current band-related role? But a couple of them do focus a little bit on my guest's beginnings in the band world, and that's a direction I'd be interested in going in first. I've read and watched and listened to quite a number of interviews that you've done, and there's lots of attention rightly paid to your career at NEC and the tradition of commissioning wind band pieces that you established there, as well as techniques of wind band conducting and score study and all kinds of stuff which is rightly seen as important. And I'd be happy not to shy away from that, because there are insights you've expressed in interviews and in your writings which professional and collegiate musicians, as well as younger band students and community band members equally can benefit from, or at least be interested to hear. I do want to go back to kind of first principles, back to your origin story. So my usual first question starts there with this. You're well known as a conductor, but what's your primary instrument?
Trumpet. But I want to condition that. When I was in college at Ithaca College, I wanted to be a competent trumpet player, but I also wanted to experience music chorally and as an orchestral player. So I sang in the best college choir for 4 years, which was one of the defining experiences of my life. I think everyone should sing. But I also, after I'd taken violin minor, the orchestra, like at that time, everybody was short of viola players. So I got myself a viola and I practiced. And in my senior year, I played viola in the orchestra because I wanted to experience music making in a band, in a choir, and in the orchestra. And that's been very helpful that I did that because it gives me I can see all the connections between all those three different things. And each one supplements something that the other one can't give. So I'm very happy that for some reason I decided that that's what I wanted to do.
And superficially, now I have a trivia question I can stump people with. What string instrument did Frank Battisti play?
I mean, my original instrument was trumpet.
So what got you into playing the trumpet, and or what got you into band specifically, if there were different or parallel impetuses for that?
Where we lived in Ithaca, across the street was an athlete who played trumpet. And so he was kind of a hero figure for me. So I was interested in him, and he played the cornet. And so I decided I'm going to play the cornet too. And so that's what I did. And I went to a two-room country school, 1, 2, and 3 in one room, and 4, 5, and 6 in the other. And the music teacher who came once a week was my first trumpet teacher. And I studied with him for probably a year, maybe a little longer. And then he says, I've taught you all I can teach you. You need now more professional teacher. So when I was still in elementary school, I used to take the bus after school once a week down to the high school inside the city of Ithaca. And I would sneak in the door and crawl along the sides of the wall because here's this little guy and all these big seniors and juniors to go to the band director's office. And I studied with him. His name was Joe Racina. So that's kind of the way I got in it. And the reason I guess I ended up being a band director was after the Second World War, the GIs were going back to school. And Ithaca College had a number of students who had played in service bands. And so I used to go to concerts and hear the band, and the band was terrific. It's then that I kind of decided I wanted to be a high school band director. That was it. Because it was just, the playing was terrific because these were not 17, 18-year-old kids. These were veterans, and they played in these wonderful groups during the war, and the band was sensational, and I was thrilled. That's it. And so that's what I decided that I was going to be. I was going to be a high school band director.
And so because I did my homework a little bit, I do know that your first couple of years in Ithaca were ones where you were not responsible for conducting a band. You just taught lessons. But once you got into the band director position, do I have it right? You were the band director at your alma mater?
I went right back to the school I graduated from. And I want to just mention, having those 2 years in which I was not responsible for the band were terrific because I studied privately on all the instruments. I just worked on being as good a teacher as I could be without all the things that goes with running an ensemble.
The admin,
So
yeah.
it was a perfect way that when I became the band director, I was prepared for it psychologically from just a point of view that I knew all the instruments. It was perfect.
So you were the band director at Ithaca for
14 years.
14 years. By the time you finished up there, as I mentioned early on in the intro, you had established a wind band piece commissioning program. At what point did you look around and think maybe that was possible? And I don't know whether this was a thought process that was that lofty for you at the time, but did you have a thought of, maybe I'd like to be more of a driving force in the band activity?
Well, this is a good story too. In the second year I taught, I was a band director. We had our spring concert. It went very, very well. Everybody was pleased. And because I lived in Ithaca, I had a lot of important musicians who came to my concerts. Walt Beeler, who at that time was in the kind of big three of Fennell, Ravelli, and Walt Beeler. There was a new person teaching composition at his college named Warren Benson. So after the spring concert, which had gone really, really well, when everybody had gone, Warren was still there. And Warren comes up and he says, "You've done a terrific job. The band sounds fantastic. But why do you play that funny music?" I was crushed. I was crushed. I'd worked so hard and the performance was so good. I was just crushed. So 2 weeks later, I thought about it because I was aware. I mean, one of the reasons why I commissioned pieces was because the music that high school bands could play at that time was not very good. So after 2 weeks, I called Warren up and I said, "Warren, you were absolutely right. That was funny music." I said, "But listen, either you got to write me a piece or you got to shut up." And he wrote me the first piece. He was the first piece we did. But that's how it started.
Well, in the author's notes on the book, The Winds of Change, which I think you had something to do with, it says, and I have the quote here, "At the beginning of the 20th century, the Wind Band was primarily an organization providing music for entertainment purposes and or civic public functions and celebrations. By century's end, the contemporary wind band or wind ensemble had developed into a viable, expressive musical medium with an increased presence in the professional artistic musical world." I don't know what I was expecting, but I wondered if your connection with Gunther Schuller from New England Conservatory was going to be the moment that kind of moved you in the direction of, okay, let's talk about bringing the repertoire into a bit more, maybe a bit more mature place.
I wanted to improve the high school band repertoire. Now, we went much further than that because the composers we commissioned, every composer I commissioned was a composer who had never written a piece for the band.
Oh.
That was one of the criteria. I wanted to bring in very, very talented composers and say to them, "You got to write a good piece for the wind band." And surprisingly, almost every one of them, the experience was terrific. And many of them told me they got their best performances from school groups because we spend time. The professional groups can play all the notes, but they don't understand what the music is supposed to express. We did because we just lived with it longer. And so, I mean, that's what I did. And of course, Warren wrote the first two pieces. Then I commissioned Vincent Persichetti because Persichetti had written some very, very good pieces. But let's put it this way. He had written 2 or 3 good pieces that were playable by a good high school band. And so I decided I'm going to commission Persichetti. So I wrote him. I told him I was going to give him $500. He writes back, he says, "I don't write pieces for $500. And I said, "You've got to write this piece. It's important that you write this piece." Well, Vincent was the kind of person that he wrote a piece if he wanted to write a piece. In other words, if you happened to catch him when he was interested in writing a band piece, you got one. But if he wasn't interested, there's nothing you could do about it. So I commissioned, I said, "Look, when you're at that point that you want to write a band piece, I want you to write one for me." And so Vincent did. He came up, he guest conducted the premiere of it. And later on, I commissioned a second piece from Vincent, but I just wanted my kids. They were so good and they were so committed that I wanted to give them the best music I could possibly give them. And so that was a motivation, the first motivation. Then it became much broader, and I decided at some point where I have to think about expanding the repertoire, not for the high school band only, but for all bands. Just get great composers who write wonderful music and get them interested in writing a piece for a wind ensemble or wind band.
With that in mind, and also thinking about the differences, obviously, between writing for band and writing for orchestra, you told a story in one of the podcast interviews that I have happened upon about communicating with, okay, my listenership needs to be sitting down for this because this is really, so you were talking with Dmitri Shostakovich, and he didn't grasp at first, is what you were saying, that you were looking for a piece for band rather than, talk a little bit about that.
I decided I should expand this not just to American composers, but I should now think about world composers. At that time, in order to contact any Soviet composer, you had to go through the Union of Soviet Composers. They belonged to that. All mail went through that. So I wrote Shostakovich. I explained who I was, what I did. I said, I'd like to have you write a piece for the wind ensemble. Well, I wrote in English. He wrote them back in Russian. I don't think he knew exactly what I was asking. And he would write back, and I'd take it up to Cornell University to a Russian professor, and he would tell me what it said. Shostakovich had mentioned this to Khachaturian. So Khachaturian wrote back to me. He thought I wanted pieces that I could make transcriptions of. So I have a pile of scores from Khachaturian, Russian published, that he sent me because that's what he thought I wanted. They didn't grasp the idea that I wanted a real piece.
An original thing, yeah.
That didn't give me what I wanted. I got some scores, but I didn't get what I wanted. But I wrote to Bernstein, I wrote to Sam Barber, I wrote to Igor Stravinsky. I got a letter back from Stravinsky saying that he did not know that high school kids liked his music. And he says, I got to write about 20 pieces before I could get to write one for you. But if I live long enough, I'll do it. Well, he didn't live long enough. I do have letters from Stravinsky written in his hand. But I just decided my students were important enough that they should have contact with these incredibly imaginative, creative people. Because I brought every single one that wrote a piece, I brought them to Ithaca, and they were there. The kids got to know the composer, and the students had an incredible sense of responsibility. They knew that they were going to, in many ways, decide whether people liked this piece or didn't like it from how we played it. And so they were really committed to it, and it was wonderful.
In talking about bringing your students the best experience that they could possibly have, I don't want to say you've fallen into my trap, but you have at least gone to a place that I wondered whether you would go. You have told a story, and I would love for you to tell it again, a story about your interaction with Benny Goodman.
Well, we used to play an assembly program for the school. I thought it was the most important program that we played because it was for our students. We had a chance to kind of influence something. I brought in Doc Severinsen. I brought in everybody I could possibly bring. I run out of people to bring. I always have a great soloist on the program. And I said to myself, hey, you haven't asked Benny Goodman. So I wrote to Benny. I didn't hear from him for about 3 months. I'm teaching in my office one day, and the phone rings. I pick it up. He says, is Frank-l-Battisti there? I said, this is Frank-l-Battisti. He said, this is Benny Goodman. How about next Thursday? I was floored. I didn't know how to respond, and I didn't know whether we could do it. I mean, the school has a schedule. I don't know whether, but I told him, I said, yeah, that's good. Let's do it next Thursday. I go to see my principal, and I says, Jack, sit down. I got something to tell you. Believe. I says, if we can have an assembly program next Thursday, I can get Benny Goodman here. So he says, oh, yeah, go ahead. We'll do it. So Benny flies up to Syracuse, New York. I go up and pick him up. We're driving down to Ithaca, and I notice he doesn't have his clarinet with him. And I say, Benny, I don't see your clarinet. He says, I didn't bring it. I said, what do you mean you didn't bring it? You're going to play with the group. They don't like my music. I'm not going to play. This was when rock and roll was, and swing was out. And I won't do it. I said, they won't like it. They won't like it. So we get to high school, and I'm trying to convince him to play. I have a picture of me leaning over Benny and trying to convince him to do this. He said, I don't have a clarinet. And he says, I'll only play a Selmer. Well, all my kids played buffets, except one kid who played a Selmer. I finally convinced him to meet with the jazz ensemble and rehearse with them. And so kids come in, start playing, and Benny stands up in front of the group, doesn't say a thing, kind of looks at him. Then he says, I'll never forget this words, I'll see you on the battlefield. That meant he was going to play. So we have the assembly, and I told I told our principal, look, let's bring all the kids into the gym, have them sit on the floor up close, and that's what they did. And when it came time that Benny was going to go out there and play, I really didn't know whether he was going to or not. I was scared to death, but somehow I got him out there, and Benny played, and the place went wild. It was terrific. And once he got started, he loved doing it. Everybody was sky high. They had to circle the high school with police and state troopers because everybody wanted to get in on it. Parents, everybody wanted to get in, and they didn't let them in. I said, look, this is for the kids. This is it. We're not playing for anybody else. And Benny had to catch a plane that evening to go to Boston. And so I drove him to Syracuse. He bought my dinner for me, and it didn't cost us a cent.
Huh.
When I told him that he didn't have his clarinet, he said, I didn't come here to play. I came here to see a band who commissions music. Because, Benny commissioned Copeland, commissioned Bartok. He says, that's what I came for. He says, I wanted to see this place where this happened. And so we finally commissioned a painting. Then 4 or 5 of the students went to New York City and gave it to Benny. So that's my Benny Goodman story. It was great. It was a wonderful, wonderful experience.
Talk about getting your kids an experience that was musical and then something else.
Everybody they met, all the composers, all the soloists, were absolutely at the top of their game. And they were interesting people. They were imaginative people. The kids immediately picked up because, see, I had the one requirement that I had for every member in my band was they had to write an original piece for their instrument every year. So they knew what it was to write something and have it played and hope that it would be played the way they wanted it played. They had experienced that intimately themselves. And so they knew and felt the responsibility when they were doing this for not just an average person, but a pretty damn important person.
They were writing whether they were going to be music students in the future or not.
That's right. It didn't make a difference. See, because the objective of my band program was that every single kid know how important imagination was, and they do something in life where they can use that imagination. That's what I wanted them to do. And so they had to be creative. I mean, imagination leads to creativity. You got to have imagination before you create something. And so they became aware of and appreciative of people who were imaginative and were creative. And in 2006, we had a reunion of the high school band. About 400 people came from all over, and we did a survey we asked them, are you still playing your instrument? If no, are you in any kind of music making thing? 75% of the kids were still involved or playing their instruments.
We win.
So that music meant something to them. The experience that students have in school should be the kind that gives them something more to live in life, more to enjoy and love in life. Their life will never be lonely because they have a friend in music. And music becomes not a nice addition, but essential to their life. No, I mean, I had quite a few kids who went into music. We had kids who played in lots of symphony orchestras from the band in Ithaca, but I wasn't doing it for them. I didn't have to. They loved music. I was doing it for the average kid who, this is going to be it. This is going to be the musical experience they have. Then I better be strong enough so it really makes a dent. And so that was the objective.
Interesting. Since not all of my podcast listenership is comprised of music educators, but rather there are a lot of people listening who did or still do play in bands for enjoyment and not certainly not as a vocation. That and the story that you're telling here has reminded me of an oral history interview that you did with the Gunther Schuller Society some time back, where you were talking about Schuller's attitudes toward the non-music making parts of the music education curriculum. I'm presuming at NEC. Is interesting. You said it this way, you said he had priorities, which seemed to include, at least as I was listening to what you were saying, that seemed as if he was not so interested in the liberal arts aspect of that curriculum, the intellectual development, even the social emotional development, versus the pure technical musical skills. And it sounded to me like you were trying to figure out how to politely express your differences with that focus.
Well, making music is what you have to do. If you want to know what music is about, you got to make it. You can't read about it. You can't do anything. You have to make it. We had no theory courses, no any kind of courses in music. They learned the grammar of music in making music, so that it was an integrated curriculum in a sense. We covered other things, but Martin Luther King had a dream. He didn't have a plan. He had a dream. You got to dream something, and then you have to hope that you can lead the people that you're responsible for as a teacher to join you in achieving that dream. All the kids knew what we were aiming for every single time we performed, and they wanted to achieve that dream. I want to educate dreamers. That's what I want. I want people to think about things that don't exist but should exist, and then go for it. And in music, you can do that.
Hi, everybody. It's narrator Rob here. At this point in our conversation, Dr. Battisti and I went considerably further afield, but then circled back to the qualities of a teacher that can inspire their students to be imaginative and creative and responsive people.
The teacher has to be passionate about a belief that music is the most important thing in life. And I teach it, and I show it. I model it. In fact, I can tell you another little story that helped me a lot. In my second year of teaching, first day of school, I sat at my desk. This new band member come in who played trombone. I said, "What can I do for you?" He says, "I don't like music." I says, "Well, Randy, why are you in band?" He looks right at me, points at me, and he says, "You're different than the rest of them, and I'm watching you." That's exactly what he said. They're watching me. I hadn't, as a young teacher, I thought they were listening to me. No, they're watching me. Everything I do, I've got to be a model of what I want them to be. I mean, I learned that, thank God, in the second year of my teaching. After that, it was completely different, because I realized that what I said, how I said it, how I reacted to things, had to be a model of how they should act. And when I didn't do it, once in a while, I would lose my cool. I would apologize. I said, I'm not apologizing about what I was talking about, but I am apologizing how I acted. Because that's not the way a mature human being should act. You teach by modeling. Young kids don't believe half of what adults say, but they believe what they see. And so you got to do what you want them to do if you're ever going to dent it.
Yeah. In my intro to this conversation, I mentioned your more active than average post-retirement life, and specifically, but incompletely, I'm going to say, that has included conducting and clinician work all over the world, being the principal guest conductor of the Longy School of Music Chamber Winds here in the Boston area. You were I didn't know this, you were the founder and the music director of the Tanglewood Institute's Young Artists Wind Ensemble. Since retiring from NEC in 99, you've written books about band conducting and literature. I don't know whether my listenership will have listened to your voice today and drawn this conclusion, but you are in your early 90s and showing no obvious signs of slowing down. On a YouTube video that is actually an interview with you, in the comment section, one commenter wrote a number of quotes that he had taken from an honor band experience he'd had with you on the podium, I think. And I've got one of these quotes here. It is, "There are in this world the accomplishers and the non-accomplishers. You can go through your life accomplishing nothing if you wish, but why? Why are we here? To accomplish something." Now, not every nonagenarian gets asked this question, I think, especially after having accomplished as much as you have to this point in your career. But with that in mind, are you looking at projects for the future?
I'm always thinking of things that needs to be done.
Do they coincide with things you want to do?
Yes, they do, because I've been, unbelievable. I can't believe it myself. I've been retired for 27 years. How many people live in retirement 27 years? I mean, not very many.
No.
So I'm very lucky. This is a great gift. So I'm 94 years old. I still have great vitality. I still want to do things. I have grown to enjoy writing. I mean, I think I've written 14 books. I might be running out of things to write about, but, um, but I do love that. I do love writing. I do love making music, and I plan to do as much of both as I possibly can. But I tell you one thing, the one thing that I have really, really enjoyed as far as being retired, the pleasure I get from listening to music is greater now than it's ever been. Because when I was making music, I had to study scores. I just had to keep studying, preparing. And even though there were achievements, you have to have time to reflect on it and enjoy it. I think that's where people who make music might not find themselves doing, because we're doing, that means preparing. So that means when you finish one, you got to be right into the next one. I mean, even when I was in high school, after a concert, we never played a note of music for at least 2 rehearsals. We go on bird walks. We go all, I mean, we're enjoying just kind of being together and sharing what we've accomplished. That's the dividend. That you have to give yourself an opportunity to do that. Otherwise, you're going to burn yourself out. You need time to be fueled by what music provides if you give it a chance to exist, or you can crowd it out and go right on to the next project.
Well, to bring these podcast conversations across the finish line, traditionally, in a year of doing this, I've asked my guests a series of questions which are less rooted in the resume, and regardless of whom I'm talking with, I can never really guess what the answers will be. And in your case, great heavens, that could be anything, considering the context here. So here goes. My first question I always ask is, what's one of your favorite pieces of band music that you've conducted or played?
The Winds of Nagual, Michael Colgrass. He wrote it for me. It's a wonderful piece. It's been played all over the place. It's a musical fable, not like any other band piece.
One of my previous interview guests mentioned that one.
He didn't want to write the piece. I mean, he didn't want to write for band. Huh. When we got to commission, we got a grant from the Mass Council on the Arts to commission a piece for the orchestra, for the wind ensemble, for the choir, and for a jazz ensemble. And so the person who was in charge of this asked me, who would I like to commission? I said, I'd like to commission Michael Colgrass because I like his music. He sends a letter out. He gets a letter back. And Mike says, I'm not interested in the band. He says, I'll write for anything else, but I don't want to write for the band. The person who was the director of this project came to me and said, Michael says he doesn't want to write it. I said, wait a minute, let me talk to Mike. I call him up and I said, before you say a definite no, I said, I'm going to send you some scores and I'm going to send you some recordings. I want you to listen to them. And if you decide at that point you don't want to do it, I accept it. 2 weeks go by, I call him up, and Michael says, I didn't know they were writing music like that now. Mm-hmm. See, he had been a member of the University of Illinois band when they were playing pieces where everything was doubled, and it just wasn't interesting. He's a rebel anyway, but he got thrown out, and he just doesn't like bands. He hated bands. He says, but I didn't know that. And he says, you tell me I could have any instrumentation I wanted. And that really clinched it right there, because the instrumentation is not a standard wind band instrumentation. So he wrote it. It was a huge success. He became one of the greatest advocates for the wind band in existence, because the performance of the best university and conservatory wind ensembles at this level, at this point, is extremely high. And most composers will tell you that they get their best performances from those groups. Mm. So that's a huge, huge difference from where composers thought bands were at the midpoint of the 20th century.
And because of that end to that answer, I want to scoot to the question I don't usually ask next, but it's this. Is there a band that you would love to perform with or conduct that you have never done?
No, I think I've done, the best band in China, all over the place. And I don't feel cheated at all. So
Is there a piece of band music that you've never played or conducted but you'd like to?
While I was at the conservatory, I played all the great wind band literature. Now that I'm not a full-time teacher and I don't have my own group, it's hard for me to really pick out a piece that I like to conduct because I don't know it well enough. Without studying it or without, playing it, doing it, conducting it. I mean, that's the big difference. The big difference is I no longer have my own group. I'm the kind of person who is trying for a level of performance that only comes from continuous, steady rehearsing. The guest conducting doesn't come close to what I do with my own groups because I just don't have enough time to be with them. Part of it is just time. You have to be together. You have to get so that you're thinking the same. You're experiencing things together, and that comes with time. And so I never would be away from school and I would lose rehearsal. I don't want to lose rehearsals. The guest conducting is nice. It can be very rewarding, but you're not going to get the same kind of performances.
It's a quick hit. Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't like making music that way.
And last, but certainly not least, it's probably my favorite question of all of these, and you may already have answered this question many times over today. Do you have a favorite band story that you'd like to tell? This is narrator Rob again, everybody. At this point, Dr. Battisti paused for a solid half a minute, staring up into the sky, formulating his answer. And here it is.
Yes, I do. And it's about the Winds of Nagual. When I commissioned Michael to do it, I commissioned him it was early fall. And he says, I'll have the parts to you by January 1st. Fine. So I get half the score just before Christmas. And then he says, the rest will be coming through. So I would get the next 10 pages, then the next 10, and the next 10. So it was kind of like, I don't know where I'm going, but we're going somewheres. Now, the parts were even better because the parts came the same way. Up to a certain point, we got the parts. And then my graduate assistant every day would go down on Huntington Avenue in Boston, right outside the conservatory. He'd wait there for the UPS delivery. And he'd pick up the box, bring it in, we'd open it up, we'd read it right there. So I didn't know how the story was going to end until 2 days before the performance. And then when Michael came, he changed a lot of things. There were like 400 meter changes and tempo changes in this piece. I mean, I worked on this so hard, and then he decides he got to change them. So the night of the concert, I said, look, I'm going with whatever it is. It's going to be spontaneous in the sense that I'm going to do what I feel I want to do. I did, and it was terrific. It came off incredibly well. And later, Mike came back. We were doing a piece called Arctic Dreams. He wrote it for the University of Illinois, believe it or not. After the performance of the premiere, he thought he'd written a bad piece. He said, that's a terrible piece. So when we were rehearsing it, I invited Mike down. We were going to play a piece. He walks in the back of the hall while we were doing some of it. And he told me, he says, oh, you can't believe how relieved I was because I really knew I had not written a bad piece. Those are my two Mike Colgrass stories.
Well, I had been looking forward to this conversation with you ever since your NEC band directing successor, Bill Drury, suggested to me that, hey, you could help such a thing up. And, sir, you did not remotely disappoint. What a pleasure this has been, certainly for me.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it, too.
Conductor, clinician, author. To say he's a leading light in the band world is to grossly undersell it, I think. Dr. Frank Battisti, thank you so much today. You've been so generous with your time. What a thrill.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll take a break while I look for my smelling salts. And then I'll be back with a dogfight mystery for you. This is BandWagon. Here comes the dogfight. This week's dogfight is another band-related internet rabbit hole of the week. where I offer up an online excursion that you may be inspired to pursue yourself, and maybe some helpful listener can properly further educate me about this one. I shall explain. Recently, as will happen, while searching for something else, I happened upon a video which led inevitably to several other similar videos. This is not exactly a breaking news item. It's otherwise known as the Internet. But in an age in which things either have zero Internet presence or you can't get away from them online, it's relatively rare, in my experience at least, to find something that is exemplified by a handful of very professional-looking videos, and that's it. As in, not just a chunk of a concert recorded by somebody using an overheating Samsung Galaxy phone from the back corner of some rinky-dink auditorium somewhere, but a piece of quality artwork with professional-grade video production propping it up, something that would make one expect to find many, many more similar videos from the same source. But in this case, nope. Mysterious. This particular internet rarity is the Budapest Winds. Now, thanks to my online rooting around, I've discovered that there is a group called the Budapest Wind Ensemble, and these are two different groups. The Budapest Wind Ensemble appears to be much closer to the wind band of, say, Beethoven's time, which is to say, probably closer to a woodwind duodectet. A couple of flutes, a couple of oboes, pair of clarinets. I can definitely hear at least one bassoon, probably a pair of French horns, occasionally a recorder or two, no other brass, very occasional auxiliary percussion. They give off just a very 18th or 19th century period drama incidental music vibe. That's not the group I'm admiring this week. Oh, and there is an ensemble known as the Budapest Wind Symphony, and that is a proper wind band, as we all understand such a thing to be, but that's not the group I'm admiring this week either. The Budapest Winds are, well, they're what we all understand as a modern wind ensemble as well, and they're awfully, awfully good. Evidence of this can be found on a YouTube channel called Michael Barry Music. Barry is a composer who has written for a number of different musical idioms, and among other things he's displayed on his YouTube channel 7 works for band of his, which the Budapest Winds have recorded. I would love to tell you much more about the Budapest Winds, but sadly I cannot, because I swear I utilized a great many internet research avenues, but I came up empty. They don't appear even to have a website, never mind a YouTube channel of their own. The only conclusion I can draw is that maybe this is, or was, an ensemble that was assembled for a very specific recording session about 2 months ago at the time of this recording, and then was never assembled again? The conductor in these videos is Cynthia Johnston-Turner, who has an international career as a band conductor and clinician. She's currently Dean of the Faculty of Music at Wilfrid Laurier University in Ontario, Canada. Before that, she was Director of Bands at the University of Georgia, and before that, a member of the Cornell University Music Faculty. She was appointed Artistic Director and Conductor of the Wellington Wind Symphony in Canada 2 years ago. So, high profile, but not regularly being so anywhere near Hungary is all. So perhaps the whole thing was indeed a one-off, let's take a week to prepare and record these half dozen or so pieces and then all go our separate ways kind of a thing. A bunch of ringers. Which is a shame, I think, because the Budapest Winds stack up really well alongside a lot of other professional and professional-sounding wind bands I've heard lately. I've included the link to Michael Barry's YouTube channel in this week's show notes. All 7 band works are there, and I would encourage you to check them out and see if you agree with me that this outfit needs to exist again, somewhere, someday. Curious. Mysterious. Stars aligned, the music was made, and then nothing? Shame about that. While you're pondering that, I'll observe one more fermata, and then I'll wrap things up for this week. Thank you for continuing to listen. To wrap up this week, let's take the CODA. For the CODA this week, it's March now. You know what that means? March Madness! And yep, people in the band world get excited around this time of year just as much as hoop fans. In the next couple of episodes, I can imagine that the big dance will get mentioned a time or two. To whet your appetite, perhaps, here's a quick little observation that I made on social media about 10 years ago. I wrote, "The proof, incontrovertible proof that the NCAA tournament isn't run by musicians is this. Thanks to arena space considerations and ticket sales, The pep band usually sits down behind the bass line in 2 rows of 15 players each. Yes, let's play an entire concert from a company front. Those pep bands make it work somehow. That's BandWagon for this week. Thanks as always for downloading and listening. BandWagon was written, researched, and produced by your humble host. Musical interludes were produced by Hamilton Media, from source material largely by John Philip Sousa. You can listen to more episodes of the pod's website, heyband.podbean.com. Please give me feedback. Let me know what you like or what you think might change. You can do that using the email address heybandwagon@yahoo.com, or leave a 90-second voice message by going to speakpipe.com/heybandwagon. Be aware that I do reserve the right to include your message on the podcast unless you say otherwise. Those contact links and links to this week's news items, conversation topics, and my interview guest, the great Frank-l-Battisti, can be found in our show notes, as can a link to BandWagon's merch store thanks to the good folks at TeePublic. Please share the show on social media, and thank you for that. If you enjoy this podcast, please do share it in the direction of somebody whom you think might not be a listener yet. Word of mouth really is the best recruiting tool. And to keep up with the pod every week, subscribe to BandWagon on the Podbean app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever fine podcasts are sold. For now, take care, stay in touch, stay in tune, and we'll do this all again next week. I'm Rob Hamilton, and it's been a heck of a week. I'm going to go sit down.